Hello viewers, this is An American Thinks, and we're back with another installment for the Thousand Worlds Book Club being run by Preston Jacobs. And for this one I am running true to form, a few days late, and I apologize for that. I have been, in my defense, it's been a very busy last couple of weeks for me for professional reasons. Very exciting things for me professionally, but unfortunately it doesn't leave a lot of time for extracurricular activities like YouTubing and so forth. So I do apologize for that, but hopefully it's been worth the wait. And fortunately for me, this story was relatively short, and Preston covered many points quite well, so it makes my job a bit easier. But before I get started, there is a small piece of business I need to take care of here. I need to give a shout out to user Zen Master Fu. In my discussion of the previous story, Guardian, Zen Master pointed out an error that I made in my discussion. And to explain this here very briefly, I had listened to the audio version of the story before making the video, and then in reading the print version afterward, I noticed this error as well. By the way, you guys probably all have noticed by now, every An American Thinks video has a minimum of 3 errors. So apparently Zen Master Fu was the only viewer careful enough to notice this particular one. So congrats to Zen Master Fu, or should I say, good on you. And with that taken care of, let's get to this story here. And I'll try to do this pretty quickly because we are really pressed for time here. So, in Preston's video, he discusses a lot of philosophy stuff, and it's really interesting. He started this one with the last one, and he's been carrying it on to this one as well. It's really good stuff. But to me, you guys probably anticipate this by now. The Tuf Voyaging series has been very theological, and even a lot of the naming schemes that he uses for the various episodes are pretty overtly theological. So it shouldn't be any surprise, and to me, this story is no different. To paint this one in very broad strokes, this story is pretty generally the biblical Old Testament boiled down to a nutshell. In the Old Testament, we have the people who get themselves into trouble. God figures out a solution, saves them, but they don't change their ways, and so he has to come and save them a second time. And again, very brief stuff. There are quite a few more analogs with Christian theology that I could point to, but it would end up being a very long video for one, and for two, this really isn't the specific direction of this channel. I don't want to spend a lot of time trying to develop this stuff to make these points, and probably those of you who are familiar enough with Christian theology can probably see a lot of these points, these analogs anyways, and the people who aren't, probably don't care quite so much. But anyways, I don't plan to go into all of these different theological points I could make. Not to say, with that said, not to say I want to discourage, any comments, discussion, following up in the video comments. By all means, go ahead. But I just wanted to touch on 2 more here in this video because they do bear on the discussion that I have. One is the difficulty of people to understand God. And in this story, the God character, Tuf, he's the only one with an EEC ship. So he's really the only one that has this picture of, the problems with the ecology of the planet and so forth, and the bioengineering and genetical manipulation that has to go on in order to try to solve this problem, and, et cetera, et cetera. So really, he's the only one that has the understanding of this, the broad scheme of things, right? The Suthlamese don't have their own EEC ship. They don't have this frame of reference. And so they try to understand him using their own frame of reference. And not surprisingly, they end up getting it wrong. So maybe we can forgive them as readers a little bit for getting this wrong. The other point, which is related to the first one, is the tendency of people to want to create God in their own image. And by that, I mean people tend to want to believe in a God that they like. And they tend to alter the details to suit their wants and needs. And in this case, we of course have the example of the cinematic piece, or I assumed it was some form of cinema, a movie or something like that. But the Tuf and Moon, that was apparently was written in his absence, and it became this huge hit. And it provided some hilarity for the story. we can probably safely assume that if Tolly Moon had written it more realistically, with more factual, kind of more documentary style rather than a piece of entertainment, the Suthlamese probably would not have received it quite so well. They would not have been very happy about it. But they were willing to accept Tuf because he was presented to them in a way that agreed with their ideals. And notably, as a way to support this point, notably, the Suthlamese didn't accept Tuf because he had saved them. They accepted him because they liked him. And in fact, when he comes back to save them the second time, and he explains to them, his whole reasons for everything and the logic behind what he was doing and so forth, they pretty much rejected him. They were not very happy campers. They did not like what he had to say very much. So I think hopefully you can agree with me and accept this idea that they had created Tuf in their own image. Now let's compare this to A Song of Ice and Fire. In A Song of Ice and Fire, we do have a few apocalyptic events. Probably the big notable one is the Doom of Valyria and whatnot. They do tend to be somewhat localized. The big one, the major one that's, I think, truly comparable in scale to what Suthlam has been experiencing would be the Long Night. And in a way, you could say they're both related to food. In the Long Night, obviously, there would be food shortages because of the cold and the limited sunlight and whatnot. Whereas on Suthlam, there's a food shortage because of overpopulation. Now, Suthlam was saved by Haviland Tuf. But in the world of Ice and Fire, who saved that world from the Long Night? Well, if you've dug into this lore of the world a little bit, you know that answer depends on who you ask. According to the Rhoynar, the Rhoynar have this legend that their river dried up and whatnot. A big deal for them. And they were saved by this nameless hero who worked with Mother Rhoyne and lesser gods in order to save their river. And if you go to Ashai, there is another nameless hero who fought against the darkness with a red sword. And of course, the modern believers of R'hllor claim that this hero with the sword was Azor Ahai. And in Yi there is a legend about a time of darkness as well, and that one was ended by a nameless woman with a monkey's tail. And then, of course, the one we're all familiar with in the north, there's the legend of the Long Night, and then there's a nameless hero who found the children of the forest. And then there was this battle for the dawn that was won by the Night's Watch, and then everything was, set to right and everything. So really, the answer to this question varies depending on who you ask. But in each case, there's a nameless hero who does something, and crisis is averted. And you can probably see where I'm going with this, but to sum it all up, all of these stories sound an awful lot like people who are trying to understand something for which they have a limited frame of reference. And following on to that, because they have a limited frame of reference, they end up explaining it in a way that they find acceptable. In the North, you want to believe that the Night's Watch are heroes, and that they are the ones that save the world. And if you're a follower of R'hllor, you want to believe that there's an Azor Ahai, and that he had this, red sword, and whatnot, and so on and so forth, right? So they have sort of created, I guess in the name of in the case of R'hllor, it's true, he's a god, but not necessarily all of them are gods, but they're the heroes, and they've sort of created them in their own image, something that they like and they can accept. And what does this mean for the future of A Song of Ice and Fire? What can we expect in the books if we're using Tuf Voyaging as an analog for A Song of Ice and Fire? Well, there's a few things that I can think of. The first one, fortunately, because we're all curious readers, fortunately I do think that the Long Night is an explainable event. I think that there is a logical explanation for that. And it may not be understood by the current people at the time of the books, but it is understandable. And following on top of that, at some point I do believe the explanation will be revealed. much like Tuf revealed to the Suthlamese his explanation for what happened in the events of their world. I think there will be an explanation that we will receive about the Long Night and all the consequential events that have followed after the Long Night and are impacting the time of the books as we are reading them. But consider yourselves warned, because I think that if we're going to carry this analog to conclusion, I think the explanation may not be agreeable. And, much like the Suthlamese people were disappointed at the explanation they received, I think the people in the world of Ice and Fire are likely not going to be very happy with the explanation that they receive for the Long Night. Because obviously they've been bastardizing this story. They've created it in their own image, and so they may not be very happy with it. But let me carry that a step further. I think that it's very likely that we as readers may not be very happy about the explanation as well. I find that George R. R. Martin is very crafty at evoking emotions in readers through the use of his characters and so forth, and his story elements. And I would not be at all surprised if we as readers have been subconsciously creating characters and creating a setting and creating a story and maybe even creating an author in our own image. And we are reading things the way that we want to see them. And at some point when all is revealed, it may be very disappointing, and it may be at least very thought-provoking, if not more than that. So, we've got about, I think the most recent release date that I read was sometime in early 2017, so we've got about a year left to, philosophize about this before we actually see what happens. So until then, thank you guys very much for watching. If you have any thoughts or comments, agree, disagree, if you find any errors, leave them in the comments below. And other than that, we'll see you guys next time.